Hello, and welcome to History of England, episode 32, Eye of the Storm. Now last time, we looked at the mid-1530s and the acts of the Reformation Parliament in moving Reformation in England along a path that Henry VIII had not really wanted and not really, it appeared, approved of, but he could not stop it, and he did not bother trying since each step gave him more power. We looked at the fates of Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, John Fisher, and the end of Henry's second marriage and the beginning of his third marriage to Jane Seymour. Now in early June 1536, a new parliament met. It had been called in the final days of Anne Boleyn. Now this parliament's main task was to discuss circumstances of the realm now that Anne had been executed for adultery. It cancelled the two acts favorable to Anne and her offspring, thus making Princess Elizabeth a bastard just like Mary. The Parliament also praised the new marriage of Henry and Jane Seymour. It's not stupid. Anyway, the Parliament took up the discussion of who was heir to the throne. Now, hopefully Jane would have male heir, but if Henry died and Jane proved infertile, then they urged Henry to name someone as heir. Henry, who had most likely been the one who entertained the discussion in the first place, agreed that when he died, his will would name his heir, which Parliament agreed on. Now the way was open for Henry Fitzroy to be made legitimate, and perhaps the next king of England. Henry IX, anyone? Anyway, now Henry Fitzroy was the least of all bad options, but on July 23rd, 1536, after Parliament had been dismissed and sent home, Henry Fitzroy died of tuberculosis. Henry VIII ordered the body of his illegitimate son secretly buried, but he now had to publicly pick which of his two daughters would be queen after him. By the way, the tomb of Henry Fitzroy can still be seen in the Archangel in Framingham, Suffolk. Meanwhile, Henry also had to deal with the crime of Lord Thomas Howard, the younger brother of the Duke of Norfolk, who was accused of treason because he had asked to be married to Lady Margaret Douglas, the daughter of the Queen of Scots. Now, the Queen of Scots, remember, was Margaret Tudor, the sister of Henry. So this meant that Howard was aiming to succeed Henry. Henry did not wish to have yet another of his old in-laws executed so soon after his late wife, and so he had Thomas Howard simply thrown into the Tower of London and the key thrown away. Howard would die there the following year. Also that summer, the convocation of the senior clergy met at St. Paul's as per usual. Hugh Gladimore, just named Bishop of Worcester, and known as the main reformer, was asked to preach. Now his sermon asked the convocation what they were achieving with every single convocation. They accused them of simply biding their time until Henry died and they could reunite with Rome. 2 weeks later, the convocation sent a delegation to Henry with a petition that complained about the numerous blasphemies and heresies circulating throughout England. The petition was really an attack on Latimer and all other radicals. It asked Henry to put an end to all reform and settle with what they had, which is basically Roman Catholicism, led by London, not Rome. So I guess London Catholicism. Anyway, Henry met with Thomas Cranmer and he ordered articles of faith to be drawn up so that the people of England knew what to believe. These 10 articles declared that the purpose was to bring unity and concord in opinion to English faith. In truth, the only unity Henry wanted was for everyone to agree that he was in charge of the church. The church is not Lutheran, the church is not radical, which meant the convocation was right in saying the church was to be pretty much Roman Catholic without Roman charge. Okay. Now, Henry did agree there are only 3 sacraments: baptism, penance, and the Eucharist. He did not deny, however, the other 4 that the Roman Catholic Church believed was wrong. Simply, he didn't mention them. Those other 4, again, are confirmation, ordination, marriage, and last rites. Now, he did denounce purgatory, said it was a invention of Rome. But he said since this is a long-time custom, it's okay to pray for the souls of the dead. He's pretty much trying to have his cake and eat it too. Now, from what we have in document form, we can see that Henry did not like the habit of kneeling and worshiping images of saints, but he did agree to Ashes on Ash Wednesday, Palms on Palm Sunday, and creeping to the cross on Good Friday. Heck, he even agreed that the old custom of the Eucharist consecrated in the Mass. Again, he was saying you can take away some things, don't take away these other things, let's have what we have for centuries, except I'm in charge, not Rome. Now, starting in May 1536, and continuing that summer, Thomas Cromwell was allowed to start closing down all small monasteries as the Reformation Parliament had ordered in the Act for the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, it would take an average of 6 weeks for every monastery to be dissolved. All bells had to be taken from the towers, all lead had to be stripped from the roofs, all plate and jewelry would be sent to London, all disposable corn would be sold off, all monks and nuns that did not go to bigger monasteries would be ordered out to the real world to find a living, and from there they passed into silence. But each process was not quiet, it was not swift. Often, crowds of people would come to the local monastery, attack the workers, and sometimes the monks themselves would resist encroachments with weapons or would use their political connections and get to Henry to order the monastery taken off the list of those to be closed. Henry would often agree, give me a small bribe, I'll take it off. But his eye had been turned to the monastery, and later on often had the monks arrested and executed for violating the royal will, and then the monastery would be closed, so Henry managed to make double the money for less trouble. Meanwhile, Thomas Cromwell issued a document that forbade the mention of purgatory, abolished many saints' days that had been celebrated as holidays, and ordered the destruction of the shrine of Edward the Confessor in Westminster Abbey. Many people were angry that the king was continuing to attack the tradition, and that anger soon boiled over into open rebellion. That summer, throughout the north, again, the north has always been the trouble in England, throughout the north, priests secretly began to talk to others about rebellion, often while they were drinking. And rumors soon reached the crown that the jewels and vessels of all northern parish churches were being stripped and replaced by tin and brass in order to hurt the crown. There are also rumors in the parishes that a new act to be forced upon England by Cromwell was that from now on all churches were to be at least 5 miles apart, that from now on all christenings, burials, and marriages would be taxed, and that only certain classes of people would be allowed to eat luxuries like white bread or goose. Meanwhile, the crown struck back at all talk of rebellion. They had priests hanged for talking about future rebellions, and laity who did rise up and riot were arrested, sentenced to death, and then sent to other places to be executed as a warning to the English. And also, no religious people were allowed to carry any weapons other than a knife to cut their meat. In October 1536, 3 groups of royal councillors came to Lincolnshire to suppress the local monastery, to collect taxes, and question the clergy. These 3 groups were attacked by a mob. The crown said, enough is enough. But while they debated on the next move, word arrived that armed villagers in Lorth, as well as elsewhere in Lincolnshire, had started to gather under a man named Captain Cobbler. And they were riding throughout the country, stopping the work of the royal commissioners, ringing the bells to rouse the people. They sent word to London. They simply wanted Henry to stop taking money from them and stop suppressing the monasteries. Oh, and let's see. Please also turn Thomas Cromwell over to us for mob punishment. Way to challenge Henry. Not a good thing to do. Now, at first, Henry decided let the local nobility handle the matter. But then the Chancellor Lincoln was pulled from his horse and murdered by a mob, with the priest leading that mob, and, well, his anger boiled. While he was meeting with his Privy Council to discuss the next step, fire beacons lit along the south shore of the Humber, and the people of Yorkshire rose up with a large army of 10,000 men meeting at the Hambden Hill. This group grew to 20,000 as they began to march on Lincoln. So Henry ordered the Duke of Norfolk personally lead a force against the mob, and he called his daughters Mary and Elizabeth to Whitehall to be protected at the same time, ordering the guard at the Tower of London doubled. Reports started to reach Henry and Cromwell now that apprentices were leaving the masters all over England, that the towns were defenseless, the tenants were rising against the lords and marching in London. So Henry ordered his Privy Council to meet with me, and he locked the door behind them. They're going to solve it, or they're not going to leave. So the rebels arrived in Lincoln, and they took over the cathedral and the chapter house. The king gathered an army in Nottingham, Huntingdon, and Stamford, and marched on Lincoln. Okay, these are southern towns, so they're marching from two directions south. The rebels forced the nobles of Lincoln to lead them out into the fight. And a civil war looked like it was going to begin, this time a religious one that would destroy England. Henry, it appeared, had been proven right. The clergy were against him. So a message arrived from the nobles of Lincoln to Henry, seeking a pardon, and stated they had been forced to lead the rebels by the mob, but they would only march to the commons of Lincoln and hold the mob there until they heard from Henry. The rebels, starting to fear for their lives, slipped away that night from their homes. The next morning, word arrived from Henry to surrender, and the mob dispersed, with many pardons given. And now a few local leaders were arrested, the local clergy were arrested, they were all hanged, everyone else was allowed to go home. The rebellion lasted 2 weeks, and it appeared it was over. One rebellion was over. But the people of Yorkshire were now eager to raise the banner of revolt. This time the revolt was more organized, since the monasteries in Yorkshire had played a more important role here, and the suppression of them hurt. They were led by a man named Robert Aske, a local lawyer who had had the bells rung in Beverley and issued a proclamation that all should swear an oath to maintain God, the King, the Commons, and the Holy Church. Of course, the bishops and nobles were kept off this list because it's widely believed that they had wickedly misled Henry, and issuing this proclamation, Robert Aske could claim he did not wish to harm Henry. No treason was being planned. Now this rebellion became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. Each rebel wore a badge depicting the 5 wounds of Christ on the cross, and there was a banner depicting the same carried in front of the rebels. The rebels' demands were simple. Return to the old faith. We have the monasteries restored, have the statues of the Virgin Mary back, and let us be worshipping as we had done in the past. Now Aske made it clear to the rebels that they are not against the king, only against those who wish to spoil the church for their own gain. All rebels were told by Aske, go get weapons, and meet again in Westwood Green. Now Lord Darcy, a steward of Henry in Yorkshire, rode to Pontefract Castle, and he sent his son off to Whitehall to inform the Privy Council that unlike the last rebellion, this one was serious. And it also seemed their agrarian and economic concerns to be settled, as well as religious ones, if Henry actually wanted some peace. By middle October 1536, the rebels had gathered and started marching on York. On the way, they laid siege to Hull, which quickly fell without a fight. Now Darcy wrote Henry asking for money and weapons to make safe the treasury of Henry that was kept at York. While he was waiting, Aske arrived at the gates with 20,000 men, issued a proclamation stating he was only after the evil men around Henry who were robbing the realm through suppressing the monasteries and imposing high taxes. The Lord Mayor of York opened the gates to Aske. Aske quietly entered with his man and agreed that for every meal this man ate, a fee of 2 pence would be paid. He also turned in a petition that was to be sent to Henry, again repeating all the earlier complaints, this time denouncing Thomas Cromwell and the bishops. And Aske ordered all the monks and nuns to go back to the monasteries in the area, and with cheering and rejoicing they did so. Now, unlike the Lincolnshire rebellion, this was a more disciplined rebellion. This time the gentry of the county seemed eager to support the rebels. They are deeply conservative in this part of England, so they mostly agreed with what the wishes of the Pilgrimage of Grace were. So Aske took 300 men with him. He marched on Pontefract Castle, and then he sent a letter to the lords gathered inside that they must surrender unless they wanted to be assaulted and killed. Now Darcy agreed to talk with Aske, and 2 days later surrendered the castle. Henry stated that Darcy failed his responsibilities, and he's now on the list of naughty people Henry did not like. And by the way, that's a list you did not want to get on. A royal herald was sent to Pontefract Castle and taken to see Aske, who was handed the proclamation from Henry, which promised, let's see, nothing. Okay. Meanwhile, Aske heard that a royal army was only 12 miles south of Doncaster and 25 miles away from Pontefract Castle, led by George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury. Aske moved his men to the Don River to oppose their crossing, and carried with them the sacred banner of St. Colbert, the patron saint of the north. There they were joined by others who decided that Aske was really right. As the rebels approached Doncaster, the royal herald met them with a message from the Earl of Shrewsbury. The message asked that blood be avoided, and that 4 men be sent to meet him, to explain to the lords assembled why they were rebelling. Aske met with his colleagues and talked about this. Now he knew if he fought the royal army and lost, the cause was lost. If he won, a religious war would begin, which would spread into the south, and this is the best opportunity because the royal army was small and could be defeated, which would leave the door open to London. Now Aske was a lawyer, however. He wasn't a military man, and so he hesitated and decided to agree to talks, even though history shows that one swift blow was sent the royal army into retreat. So Aske chose 4 men to go to the royal camp, where they met with Shrewsbury and the Duke of Norfolk and other lords of the army. The delegates had memorized their complaints, and Norfolk wrote it down and agreed to a conference of 30 men to meet at Doncaster Bridge, where all these matters would be discussed. Norfolk then arranged for a truce, and the pilgrims agreed to go home with the knowledge that their complaints would be heard by Henry. Now Henry, of course, when he heard about this, was extremely angry. He wanted the rebels destroyed, but Norfolk convinced him that since the rebels had dispersed, they would not rise again, and that Henry now had time to wear down his opposition. Aske, meanwhile, continued to believe that Henry secretly agreed with him, and soon Cromwell and Cranmer would be removed, and all would be right with the world again. On November 2nd, 1536, a royal pardon was issued to all rebels north of Doncaster, except for Robert Aske and 9 others, whom Hugh Gladmore had preached against that previous Sunday at St. Paul, saying they were deceiving the poor, ignorant people. Now Norfolk, meanwhile, went to meet with Henry at Windsor. And Henry, remember, was extremely angry. But he calmed down. He wrote out an answer to Aske and the rebels. Now his response was that he, more than any other English king, preserved the purity of the true faith. He refused to back down on what he had done so far. He warned them they needed to back down or face his wrath. He also sent a message to Darcy, suggesting Aske be kidnapped and killed, but Darcy refused foolishly, and with that refusal made it clear to Henry that he was on the wrong side of history. But Darcy, not Henry. Anyway, after all, Darcy had too easily surrendered Pontefract Castle. Henry, meanwhile, targeted other northern lords who he believed were secretly rebelling against him. Now, word soon arrived that copies of the rebels' petition were circulating in London, and that Aske was back in the field, meeting with rebels in York and Pontefract, planning another rebellion. Henry ordered the Duke of Norfolk, go north, demand at once the outright surrender of the rebels, and Norfolk said this is not likely. Henry grew angry. But Henry knew he needed Norfolk at this point, so he promised a royal pardon and said, tell them I'll call a parliament to meet in York to consider the demands. Meanwhile, Henry was raising another royal army to meet the rebels and defeat them in the field once and for all. So Norfolk met with Aske and his colleagues again. He agreed that Henry was being misled by Cromwell, and he'd been by the late Anne Boleyn. He stated that Henry now knew what he needed to do because Aske had shown him the way, but that Henry could not back down to terrorist demands. So the pilgrimage dispersed peace, while Henry considered all their requests sympathetically. On the question of the suppressed monasteries, Norfolk stated that they would be allowed to be restored until Parliament met again to consider the matter. Of course, all this was lies. But Henry had said, promise anything, get the rebels to disperse, and so Norfolk did, and the rebels were offered free pardons and did disperse. Aske rode to Pontefract Castle, told the rebel leaders the rebellion had met its goals, tore off his badge, and went home. On December 15th, 1536, word arrived for Ask that Henry wanted to meet him and speak frankly about the causes and course of the Pilgrimage of Grace. Ask agreed to meet with Henry and went down to London. When he saw Henry, Henry rose from his throne, he hugged Ask, and he agreed to hear everything Ask wanted to talk about. Now, Ask stated that the formal rebels would be happy if Cromwell would be fired. That's all they wanted. Henry gave Ask a present of a jacket of crimson satin and asked him to write down the history of the last few months that Henry could read and understand everything. Ask said it's fine, and he went back home. Of course, Henry was lying. Henry lies a lot. Anyway, Henry did not intend to halt or reverse the suppression of the monasteries. He did not intend to repeal any of the reforms of the Reformation Parliament, and he would never, ever agree to summon a parliament to meet in York. But Ask could be useful to the crown because there were rumors of yet another rebellion in the north, and Ask was asked to help suppress this to prove he was loyal. There was indeed another rebellion in the north, but this was even more serious than the Pilgrimage of Grace. This rebellion was led by Sir Francis Bigod, from a large northern family whose castle was 3 miles north of Whitby. Bigod was a debt-ridden scholar who believed that he was not loved by the crown because of his studies. Now, Bigod had witnessed the Pilgrimage of Grace. He did not trust Henry's promises. He was not a tried and true Catholic, however. He was an old-fashioned lawlord who detested the monastic system, yet feared for the northern lands and wished to protect them. And his ancestors, by the way, had fought Henry I and Edward III, so rebellion came naturally to him. Bigod met with a crowd of people in the north. He addressed them, persuading many to join him. It was decided they would catch a Hull and Scarborough and hold them until the Parliament met at York as promised. But in trying to capture these places, the rebels were repulsed. So, the rebellion failed in its first moves, and local gentry, wanting to show loyalty to Henry, called out their bannermen. Now, these bannermen were led by the Duke of Norfolk, who had personally had an army of 4,000 men, most of whom had ridden to Ask, but now who were eager to atone for their previous actions. The rebels were hunted down, ambushed, and slain. A small group of rebels attempted to attack Carlisle, but they were defeated and captured. Norfolk now issued a proclamation ordering all the rebels to come to Carlisle, where they would submit to royal mercy. So the rebels came and gave their excuses for rebellion. Henry's wrath was not sated. He ordered Norfolk to make examples of many of the rebels, no matter if they're male or female, no matter if they're young and old, child, old people, middle-aged, whatever. Every single one were ordered hanged in every town, hamlet, and village in the north, and don't show any pity. Henry ordered that the prisoners would be given trials by juries made up of family members who had passed guilt and sentence, and many were indeed hanged. Some of them had their bodies gibbeted, which means after death, chains would be wrapped around, they'd just be hung as a further example. Now, all this brutality and terror worked. There were to be no more rumors and whispers of revolt, nor to be any more complaints about the suppression of the monasteries. The people had learned. Now they were quiet. The leaders of the revolt were sent to London to be held at the Tower of London, waiting for the king's justice. Lord Darcy, one of those leaders, was tried for treason in Westminster Hall, found guilty, sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. But Henry VIII ordered his sentence commuted to simple beheading on Tower Hill. He's such a nice guy. Robert Aske was also tried and found guilty. He was sentenced to be hanged, and he was taken back to York, where the sentence was carried out. His body was then hung in chains from the walls as a warning. Now, it's interesting that the rebels had simply held together and seized their chance. They could have marched on London and forced Henry to do what they wanted, maybe even forced Henry off the throne, but they failed. And the process revealed to the crown that there were people who were not happy with the religious policies of Henry and Cromwell. Majority of the people simply wanted the parish churches maintained as they'd always been. They did not want any change to occur. They wanted the Pope back in control over England. They denounced Luther and other reformers as heretics. But Henry had faced them down. He defeated their leaders. He broke promises of course, but he'd shown that his cunning and true feelings. He'd won. And there's going to be no turning back the clock. So next time, we're going to look at the movements of Henry in the following year, and also examine his personal life in marriage to his third wife, Jane, for she'd become pregnant, and it seems she was carrying the heir to the Tudor dynasty, with many more to come in the following years. So stay tuned to find out more, my friends.